Good evening, everyone. Check, there it is. Good evening, nice to see you. Thank you for being here tonight. And it's so wonderful to have you here, but also it's so great to see our museum so full of life. If you've been walking around, it is just packed. What a great thing. So I'm Brian Ferriso, the director, and it gives me great pleasure to continue our series in celebration of the 125th anniversary, Curators in Conversation. And this was an idea that the curatorial team and I thought about. And I'm a little bit selfish in my desire to do this because recently someone asked me, why did you get into museum work? And I said, you know, there's the art. I love the art, certainly that. But I love being around really smart people. And I love to learn. So this is really about a journey for me to learn more and maybe taking you on that journey to learn more because we've got a really wonderful curatorial staff and they're very smart. So it gives me great pleasure tonight to have this conversation with Dr. Dawson Carr, and I want to give a brief introduction about Dawson. But before I do that, I want to recognize, you know, this museum has an incredible history with our councils. And our European American Art Council is one of the mainstays of our council system. It is now being led by Patty McMahon. Is Patty here? Where's Patty here? If she's not here, thank you, Patty. Please relay the message. All the members of the European American Art Council, thank you for your support. Thank you for your advocacy and all that you do for this museum. It's really quite special. I would also like to recognize Janet and the late Richard Geary. Janet and her husband Richard, as you may or may not know, made a transformational gift to this museum around 8 years ago where they endowed the Curator of European Art position. And it's now the Janet and Richard Geary Curator of European Art. And that was transformational because it was the first opportunity we had to bring in a full-time Curator of European Art. And we certainly hit a home run with being able to recruit and have Dawson Carr come and join our team. So a lot of thanks to Janet, who is just our recent past president and serves on the board today. I'd also like to recognize Laura and the late Roger Meyer. They've also supported this area of the collection quite significantly with endowments, among other things. So Laura continues to be a great advocate for this museum and a wonderful supporter. So a big thanks to Laura Meyer. Now, let me give the introduction to Dawson Carr. Dawson is the Janet and Richard Geary Curator of European Art, joining the museum in January of 2013. As the museum's, as I mentioned, first full-time curator of European painting and sculpture. He is responsible for the research, documentation, and interpretation of art made in Europe from antiquity all the way up to 1900. He also organizes exhibitions and does publications and helps develop the collection. From 2003 to 2012, Dr. Carr served as curator of Spanish and Italian paintings, 1600 to 1800 at the National Gallery in London. In addition to spearheading notable acquisitions, including works by Annibale Carracci, Guercino, and Giovanni Paolo Panini, he curated the exhibitions Caravaggio, The Final Years in 2005. We'll talk a little bit about that show. Velázquez, 2006 to 2007. Pompeo Battoni, 2008. And Venice, Canaletto and his rivals in 2011. From 2009, he also served as head of display overseeing special installations and gallery renovations at the National Gallery. So when you go to London, you can see Dawson's impact. As curator at the J. Paul Getty Museum in Los Angeles from 1987 to 2003, he was involved principally with the acquisition of paintings and planning for the new museum at the Getty Center. There, he organized exhibitions on Dosso Dossi, court painter in Renaissance Ferrara, in 1999, and Orazio Gentileschi in Genoa in 2002 to 2003. Dawson Carr received a BFA from SMU University in Dallas, where his passion for the art of Spain while working at the Meadows Museum. And if you do get to Dallas, please go to the Meadows. It's a wonderful journey in Spanish Baroque art. He earned his doctorate from the Institute of Fine Arts in New York at New York University and has written extensively on Italian and Spanish art of the Renaissance and Baroque periods. And it gives me great pleasure to go on to have this conversation with Dawson. And what we thought about today was to talk a little bit about the history of our collection, because there's some real gems in how it developed. Because I think the history of collecting for this museum in particular with the 125th is really quite significant. I've asked Dawson to pick out a few key moments, talk about them. We're then going to talk a little bit more about his career, how he came to be such a prominent scholar, but also how he developed his own passion and love for art. We'll talk a little bit about some of the exhibitions, and then I have a surprise. I mentioned one other. We have a dream acquisition that Dawson's going to talk about, so maybe someday we'll acquire that piece or something like it. So let's jump right in, and what are we looking at here, Dawson? Let's talk about this. For those of you familiar with the museum, you may know this image, but let's touch on it and talk a little bit about it.
Well, here we have one of the original museum founders, Henry W. Courbet, who was a businessman, served as United States Senator, and he was the one who gave the initial $10,000 gift. Here we go. I think it's fallen. Sorry, folks. It's gone.
Can you take your lanyard off?
No.
It was on. It may have just fallen.
Yeah,
This is fallen.
that's okay.
That's why it's sounding so funny. Thank you very much.
Okay, sorry.
Mr. Courbet gave the initial $10,000 gift, which in the 1890s was a princely sum, to purchase plaster casts. And you see the plaster cast gallery. This is on the top floor of what was then the library. This isn't the building the library's in now. And for years, this was the heart of the museum. And what they went for were great works of Greek and Roman art, the basic canon that was developed over the succeeding years and millennia in Europe.
So when we did Gods and Heroes, if you remember that exhibition with the British Museum, the curator Ian Jenkins was here, and he knew exactly where these plaster casts were made in Italy. It was quite astonishing. He knew exactly the location and the year, and he was so excited to see them. For those of you who don't know, these are now part of the collection. Although they're about 105 years old, 110 years old, they've entered the collection as works of art. So we care for them at the highest level. And then this picture.
This was the first European painting given to the museum in 1913. And we're going to have a series of slides here of donations by the Ladd family. And this is Charles E. Ladd, who was the son of William S. Ladd, the two-term mayor of Portland, and the brother of William Meade Ladd, who was one of the original founders of the museum. And Oswald Achenbach was a distinguished member of the Dusseldorf School, and this magnificent work is on view upstairs.
Yeah, very strong sense of realism. Dawson, mention when you entered our galleries, when you were thinking about this opportunity, I think you said this picture in particular stood out.
I think this is an outstanding work. Normally, we focus on French art of the 19th century. And so this was an unusual thing to have come to Portland in these years. And it's wonderful that we're able to represent a very distinguished school of European landscape painting. The Ladd family also gave this work in 1913. Maybe they were getting together to try to spur others to give works. Kouros' marvelous ponds at the Ville d'Avray. And today, Brian revealed to me that he's been here.
Yeah. So when I came and looked at this museum as an opportunity, I saw this picture and I was like, wow, I want to work there. This is a major picture. If you've been to Rouen in France, the salon picture that Kouros did is there. It's much larger than ours. He did a number of these pictures, images, as also to be sold. But why I mention this, because I've always had a deep passion for Kouros, given my own painting interests, and I decided it's 20 minutes, maybe 30 minutes, right outside of Paris. You can jump on the train, and you can go right to this location. And if you squint, it looks like that. Or if you take off your glasses, it looks like that. There's a little cafe and a hotel where I know he spent time at. It was really exciting for me to walk around. I didn't see the cows, though. I didn't see them.
And one more picture from the Ladd family, a really major gift in 1931. A great work by Delacroix. This is something that any museum that collects European art would love to have. It had been in the Armory Show in 1913. The Armory Show didn't just include avant-garde works like Marcel Duchamp's Nude Descending a Staircase. There were also some works from the preceding century in France as well, and this was one of them.
And if you do go to Paris also, and you haven't been to the Delacroix Studio and Museum, I highly recommend it. It's off the beaten track, but it is a great little adventure to go see his actual studio. You know, he died quite young. To see the master's hand and what he did and where he did it, I think is really quite special. I highly recommend that.
And you should go when you've had enough of the packed galleries at the Louvre and the Musée d'Orsay and the like, because very few people go there, and it's just a wonderful experience every time I've been.
Yeah. And for those of you who don't know this picture is asked for often. Yeah. A lot of loan letters, requests come in for this picture. It's not a very large one, but it is quite impactful and important. And we adore our Renoir here, so let's talk a little bit about Winslow Eyre and our two great Renoirs.
Winslow Eyre was a lumberman and amassed a very fine collection of French landscape paintings of the Barbizon period and Impressionist works as well. And both of these magnificent works by Renoir are just two of the many that he gave to the museum. And I should mention, Mr. Eyre was one of the original founders here, and though Henry W. Courbet provided the $10,000 to buy the plaster casts, it was Mr. Eyre and his wife who went to Europe and selected the works that would be cast.
Yeah, and iconic Impressionism, especially the landscape on the left, the city scene out into the landscape, the Seine there. Also, I mentioned this picture. This was featured in a major exhibition at the Philadelphia Museum of Art by Renoir on the left there. And it was so important to their exhibition, the director called me up and personally, she was on the beach, Anne Darnacourt, called me up and she said, Brian, this picture is so important. We need this to come to Philadelphia. And I think we arranged an exchange. So this is in about 2008. And it said a lot to me how important this is. I also recommend, notice the wonderful light in this. I mean, it captures all the details of what a great French Impressionist painting. And then the piano lesson certainly also is requested a lot.
The two girls reading, yes.
Yeah.
I should just mention with regard to the Seine at Argenteuil that there's a work by Monet, same virtual dimensions. They were painting side by side on the same day, and the figure of the man at the end of the pier in the Monet has made it onto the boat and is looking down into the boat, and I'm sure that's why Anne wanted it, to juxtapose it with the Monet that's in a private collection.
I'm sure of it.
And finally, among the original founders of the museum, we come to Charles Erskine Scott Wood, who I think most of you know. He's a Portland icon. He was in the Army, an adventurer, an author, and a real activist, as we would call him, for civil liberties. He was also one of the founding forces behind our library as well. And on his death in 1944, he bequeathed Courbet's self-portrait as a cellist, one of the most major works in our collection. It had been hanging here for decades before and came on his death in 44.
And if you look closely, talk a little bit about this picture, and you may not see it well in this image, but look closely to the upper right, about a foot by a foot. It's cut out. And what's the thought on that, Dawson?
It's not so. Can we bring the lights down on us just a little bit up here? It's much more apparent in this photograph than you're seeing here. There's a rectangle right there that's been cut out of the original canvas and had this piece of music inserted. And so you ask, why? What in the world is this about? And the painting went down to be restored at the Getty. And the restorers there could not be definitive about it, but it certainly looks as though it was sewn in early on. And so it's probably something Courbet was doing, some experimentation. There is another version of this picture, a very polished version, where there's nothing behind the figure, and it's in the National Museum in Stockholm, very, very close to ours. The expression in ours is a bit more complex, though, somehow a bit more brooding than the one in Stockholm. And those of you who play know full well that,
Oops.
can you go back?
Yep.
Know full well that it's a self-portrait that's been made in a mirror, because even left-handers bow with their right hand. So. Now, Charles Francis Adams was not one of the original founders, but he was very significant in our history. His taste was very similar to Winslow Ayres. He loved the Barbizon school. He loved Impressionism, and his collection came to us on his death. I should also mention he was a banker, and he had served as the museum's treasurer for decades. And this was through some very dark times when he was really having to raise money, invest his own money to keep the place going. And so he's one of the real heroes in the history of this institution. At the top, you see Boudin's view of the harbor at Brest, and beneath it, the chilling, truly chilling, wintry scene along the Seine at Lavacour, painted by Monet very early in 1879. Monet's wife is critically ill at this point. He knows he's going to lose her, and he's very depressed, and he's out bitter cold that winter in Paris. He's out on the Seine in his little studio boat painting this scene with ice flows in the river, and there's not a hint of happiness in this one. It's truly a dark winter scene.
When we did Seeing Nature, if you recall that exhibition, we got a real sense of Monet's career, early pictures, and we had a nice picture of this period. Also, I like this pairing in particular because Monet was inspired by Baudin to paint. I mean, he ran into him. Apparently, the story goes that he ran into him in Normandy at a paint shop as a young teenager, and he was inspired by Baudin to become a painter, and very much part of his beginnings. Also, I mentioned Charles Adams. One of our emeritus trustees, Chita Becker, that's her grandfather, and she remembers the Monet, she's told me several times, hanging above her grandfather's fireplace, and eventually came to the museum. So a great story, and I think it's a great story about patronage as well. Now, we put this in here, and Dawson and I were talking about this. This is a fabulous story. Let's talk about these Palmero reliefs.
There have been a lot of individual donors to this institution, and not just from the great families of Portland. And these works were given in 1954. They're very great funerary relief portraits made in Palmyra, the great Roman outpost in the middle of the Syrian desert, one of the great crossroads in that region. And the locals brought Roman types, took Roman types, this type of funerary portrait of figures disposed frontally, looking out at us side by side when they're paired. They can be three or more as well. And they took it and made it their own. You see traces of Near Eastern style, particularly in the eyes of the relief on the left. You can see how that Eastern style morphs into Byzantine types. And these are marvelous, vivid portraits meant to mark tombs. And they were given to us by a Syrian immigrant to Oregon just after 1900, Aziz Atiyah, who with his brother founded Atiyah Brothers, the now famous carpet store, now down in Tigard. And their presence here illustrates the importance of museums. And I'm going to say something controversial. And the importance of works of art existing far away from their points of origin. Because if these works had remained in Palmyra, they would have suffered a fate like this. This is the National Museum in Palmyra after it was liberated from the Islamic State. And you see what they did to the museum. They blew up major monuments as well. And I can't mention this without paying tribute to our colleague, Khalid AlAsaad. The archaeologist born in Palmyra, he spent his life studying the city. He was the director of the museum there, and he gave his life in 2015 rather than reveal to the IS fighters where he had hidden the portable treasures of the museum in Palmyra.
Yeah, it's quite a shame. It's really affected the art world, the war and the combat there and some of these great masters. And I love that we pointed this out because I think those are the works sometimes that we walk right by. And I just encourage everyone to go to that gallery, go to the top of the stairs, go to the right, and they're on the end there.
Go to the next one.
Yes. Next one?
The thing I wanted to mention to you is this. This is an area that probably most of you don't know much about. But these works are truly world class. These are the level of our Monet water lilies. These are major works of art. There are not better Palmyran reliefs in the Louvre, the British Museum, or the Met. These are truly fabulous things. And what a beautiful moment to remember that immigrants to this country bring works of art from their home country and want them represented in a local museum.
And it really supports the idea of the Universal Museum. The Universal Museum, the idea of showing world cultures, that no one ultimately owns humanity or great works of art. We all own it. We own our history, and it's important to share it. And I think these are a great example of that. And then, of course, the Monet, I'm glad you mentioned that, quite a picture, really, 1914-15, showing the sky through the water and really taking modernism to the next level. What a brilliant artist. And the story of how this got here is quite fascinating as well. And Dawson, what are your thoughts on this picture?
Well, this really illustrates that a museum like ours is a product of the local community, of the things that they collect and are interested in and choose to give to the local art museum, and the work of a professional staff that tries to buy other things, other examples of works of art. And in this case, this work was bought in 1959, and it was bought from the proceeds of a fabulously successful Van Gogh exhibition that was held here the preceding year. And so they couldn't have done anything better with that money than invest it in this way, because there's no way that we could possibly afford this today. Buying it in the late 50s was the time. And Nanny Warren told me that when her husband Bob was chairman of the board, I think in the 70s or early 80s, that they were going through another very tough financial patch here. And he was having a real hard time raising money to get them through. And so he put out the rumor that they might have to sell the Monet. And the checks came pouring in. So.
Well, I also heard, I don't know if it's true or not, but I'll just say it. I heard there was great debate whether you should spend the $50,000 for this picture. Do you go for it and take that risk? Well, let me put it this way. We're in the midst of a capital campaign. And I think this picture would probably be more than our entire capital campaign, so. Quite remarkable. And I love this picture. This is in a publication on Monet. This is him actually painting our picture in Giverny. There he is on the right. And is that his second wife there?
I think it must be.
Yeah, and
it's
on the left.
Certainly a family photograph. It was made on the 8th of July, 1915. Mm-hmm. Monet out in his garden painting away.
Yeah, I love that history.
Well, yes.
Samuel Crest, we have to talk about him. Let's explore this a little bit.
The next two patrons of the museum that I'm going to show you never lived here. The first was Samuel H. Crest, who made his fortune with 5 and 10-cent stores. Some of the members of the audience will remember them. I certainly remember them as a boy. And one of the things he insisted upon was all of his stores had to be very beautiful architecturally. And so he built beautiful buildings all over. Here's the Portland store at the corner of 5th and Morrison. Williams Sonoma is now long gone. It's a Nike store now. They have beautiful, beautiful glazed terracotta rosettes on the facades. And Mr. Crest used his fortune, went to Europe, and bought like a wild man. He collected over 3,000 works of art. The creme de la creme fills a whole series of galleries at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, and the rest of the collection was distributed among 90 institutions all over America, principally in places where he had done business. And so it was his philanthropic gesture, and without Mr. Crest, most of these 90 institutions wouldn't have a prayer of representing the history of particularly Italian art well. And so we're going to show you a few of the things from the 30 paintings and 2 sculptures given to us by the Crest Foundation in 1961. The Aldobrandini triptych by a follower of Bernardo Daddi, the workshop of Bronzino, Holy Family, Bernardo Strozzi's marvelous St. Lawrence giving the riches of the church to the poor from about 1635. And then finally on the right side of the screen, they weren't all Italian. This is our best early Netherlandish painting by Jacob van Ooststanen. He's the first Amsterdam master for whom we have a name. This work was made in 1517 and depicts the circumcision of Christ, and it's much finer than this slide would lead you to believe. And it's a real treat up in that gallery, a real attractor of visitors to the museum. You see them flocked around it, examining the marvelous technique. And it's a picture where you can see, over time, the underdrawing, the drawing that he created underneath. The paint has become transparent enough in certain sections that you can see this drawing through the paint. So it's a marvelous work on all sorts of levels for our collection.
And I just want to pause because the idea of Crest distributing to 90 museums across the country has had a profound effect. And nearly every museum I've worked in, we've had Crest works, which have been foundational to the Renaissance collection and really helped launch many museums and really made communities, I think, quite rich.
Yes, and Portlanders, by and large, collected French art. This isn't at all atypical of the time period. Very few collected Italian works, and we really wouldn't be able to do much with Italy without the Crest collection. The other benefactor who never really lived here was Edwin Binney III. And here you see Dr. and Mrs. Binney with Dr. Francis Newton, then the director of the museum. This is at the opening of an exhibition in 1962, a photograph from the Oregonian. And it was an exhibition drawn from Mr. Binney's fabulous collection of Persian and Indian paintings. The collection, particularly from the Indian subcontinent, Mary Beth has told me, it's simply one of the finest ever assembled. And the museum really desperately wanted it. It did not come here. He did leave us some Persian and Indian paintings, but the great collection went to the museum in San Diego. They lived in La Jolla, so it was their local museum. The connection with Portland was that Mr. Binney's mother had been born here and retired here. And so he would come to visit her, fell in love with the city, and I should also say that this is always a moment that I truly enjoy because Mr. Binney's fortune came because he was the grandson of the inventor of Crayola crayons. And if we can go to the next slide, he also collected French art at a very high level. And he was a scholar of French art, ballet, opera, a truly learned man. This is Philippe de Chanson's Adoration of the Shepherds, one of the great treasures of our collection, painted in Paris in the 1640s and representing French classicism at its best. And I'll show you one other. This is Gabriele Ravel's portrait of a sculptor. We had this cleaned and restored year before last and got a little surprise. The statuette behind with the missing arm had been painted out in a prior restoration. And so we saw this and finally understood why what had been floating fingers above the bust on the table had been composed that way. And this is a really magnificent thing.
Beautiful.
The French scholars who come all swoon over this.
Yes. I mean, the facial features, the texture, the modeling is first rate. Now, I want to shift gears a little bit and talk a little bit about Dawson's journey into becoming a curator. And I think we decided we're going to start here with this painting, a ceiling fresco piece in Spain, Luca Giordano, and this was a painting in particular that Dawson wrote his PhD dissertation on. And talk a little bit about this work and how you came across it and why this painting.
Well, I should say for any young people who are out there this evening that I went to Madrid. Luca Giordano was a Neapolitan painter, and as a Neapolitan in the 17th century, he was a subject of the King of Spain. And they had been trying to get a major fresco decorator to Spain since the days of Philippe II, and in the middle of the 16th century. And in the 1690s, finally, the last of the Spanish Habsburgs convinces Giordano to come, and he spends 10 years working in Spain. And I went to Spain, and I worked on his 9 major fresco projects. And I came back, and I wrote about one. This is the lesson of a PhD in getting you to be reasonable about what you take on. This is one of a series of frescoes that decorate the Escorial, the great monastery, palace, and pantheon of the Spanish Habsburgs, about 30 miles from Madrid. And this is just one of the frescoes he did there. This is over the imperial staircase, and it shows the adoration of the Trinity by the founders of the Habsburg dynasty in Spain, Charles the Fifth. Is it the one at the
green one, lower green. There it is.
There's Charles V and Philip II, the founders of the dynasty, offering up their crowns to the Trinity. There's the reigning monarch, the last of the Spanish Habsburgs, Charles II, with his wife and mother, presenting this vision of heaven. This is a vast thing over this staircase. Most of the frescoes at the Escorial, I should say fresco wasn't something much practiced by Spanish artists. They needed to get an Italian. This is painting into wet lime plaster. And once it dries, those colors are affixed and can be very permanent if the fresco is well taken care of. And it requires, because of this drying plaster, it requires that you work quickly. And Giordano had the nickname Luca fa presto, which means Luca does it fast. And he was absolutely perfect in this medium. And on this commission, there's extraordinary correspondence between the prior of the monastery and the king back in Madrid, so that we can follow it virtually day by day, what Giordano was up to. And it was a wonderful journey. I decided in part to do this because I knew that I wanted a museum career, and I knew I would never be working on this kind of grand decoration again. And I should say just about my origins that when I started college, I was a theater design major. And so I suppose it only follows that I would be attracted to the very theatrical Baroque, and with its marvelous sense of movement, plays of light, and the like.
So this is what you share with Leonardo da Vinci.
Yes.
So then the Getty, and I think it's had you and I have talked about this. helping build that collection has been something you're very proud of.
I am proud, yes. It was 16 years there. When I first started at the Getty, we were in the Getty Villa, and when I first visited that hilltop, there was nothing going on there. It had been recently bought, and they moved earth around for 2 full years before they started any sort of construction. And it was a great privilege. I went to the Getty thinking I'll stay 3 years or so and then move along to another job. And once there, you get really hooked in, because at least at that time, those were the glory years, because you knew you were doing something that very few ever have the opportunity to do in terms of building a collection and installing it in a new museum.
Do you remember, Dawson, meeting Richard Meyer at all? Were you involved with the firm?
Oh, gosh, yes.
Okay, all right, okay.
And his partner, the managing partner for the Getty project, Michael Palladino, as well.
I think this is $1 billion.
Yeah, they admit to $1 billion.
Yeah, they admit to it.
So I bet it was a lot more than $1 billion.
Yeah, okay.
It's a lot of travertine. And at one point, they got behind in shipments of travertine. And to keep the building on schedule, they actually flew a plane load of travertine over from Italy to keep the work going. Such is the life of a rich institution.
But you didn't get a chance to work in the building because you departed. Well,
No, I did get a chance to
okay.
work. I spent about half my time, 8 years in the Villa, and about half the time up at the Getty Center. That was quite a transition. I lived in Venice, and so my commute to the Villa was along the Pacific Coast Highway, and it was like heaven. And so in that sense, this was not great, but we did end up with much more beautiful galleries and offices there.
Yeah, and here's an example.
There's an early shot of the paintings galleries. And the one thing you really have to credit Meyer for is creating a museum with very, very beautiful light. They've done a bit of backsliding since I was there. It used to be that they tried to maintain the louvers so that you maximize the use of natural light, and they've kind of thrown up their hands and have stopped them way down. So you have a component of natural light, as we do here as well in the Beluski galleries, but not as great as it ought to be. I also did
talk
the
about
first
this exhibition,
painting exhibition, Old Master Painting Exhibition at the Getty Center. And it was on a wonderful master, Dawson W, who worked up in Ferrara in the northeast of Italy, and at a very great court, the court of the d'Este family. And this work, there are 3 works by Dawson in the Getty Collection, 2 of which I worked on. But this work was one that came to the exhibition. It's from the museum in Krakow. And I decided to show you this. It's one of my favorites. It depicts Jupiter. You can see Jupiter on the left. He's got his thunderbolt identifying him at his feet. And beside him, Mercury with his attributes. And it's probably virtue. There's a great deal of discussion and disagreement about who the woman who's coming and wanting an audience with Jupiter, and Mercury's telling her, no, he's busy. He's not to be interrupted. And here he is painting butterflies. But if you look closely, and it's much more evident in the original, as soon as he completes the butterflies on the canvas, they fly off. And so he's creating butterflies, and it's this lovely allegory of the power of the art of painting.
And just the handling of the drapery is fantastic. And then National Gallery London.
2003.
What beckoned you?
Well, the National Gallery beckoned me. It's one of the greatest collections in European painting anywhere. In a very, very great city. I loved my 10 years there. But it was absolutely, here you see the Spanish gallery. I was the curator of the whole of the Spanish school. This is the 17th century Spanish gallery, room 30 at the National Gallery. You see Velázquez's Roque Venus there on the left side. 9 works by Velázquez in the collection, the largest collection of his works outside the Prado. And the next slide will show you an adjacent room, this is the largest gallery in London. It's the Italian Baroque Gallery. And this was early on. This shot was taken early on in my time there because at the time that I left, I had completely double hung the room. There were just so many wonderful works sitting in storage that we just packed it in and people loved it.
Now tell me, weren't those skylights covered for some time, were they?
They were, and one of the big projects of my last 3 years there, the director asked me to kind of step outside my usual role and work on two things, and one was the renovation of galleries that had been modernized in the 1950s with dropped ceilings. They hated this Victorian architecture, and so they dropped the ceilings, cut out a lot of the natural light, made the spaces much more constrained. They were more intimate, yes, but we were undoing all of that. And it needed someone to act for the director, to act for the curatorial department, and just keep it going. We also used this opportunity to totally redo the lighting, and it's all LED lighting now in the National Gallery. When you go now, it's almost done. They've done a little bit more since I left, and they've just about got the whole place undone from the 1950s. And now, 100 years after it was created, that Victorian architecture and decoration looks wonderful. But in the 1950s, they just hated it.
So Dawson and I were talking about this. This is a great controversy. And you're looking at this picture going, how can this be a controversy? Well, we're going to explain. And when you take a Titian next to a Rubens and put it near a Cezanne, you've created something that's quite different for audiences in the history of art. But talk a little bit about this project.
I did a couple of exhibitions, 4 exhibitions in all, but a couple that I'm going to show you in a little bit. But I think of all the things I did at the National Gallery, this was my favorite. And the director came to me and asked me to celebrate, in some way, a recent acquisition. And the painting in the middle is Titian's Diana and Octaeon, which had just been acquired for £50 million, which is a very low price for it, from the Duke of Sutherland. And he thought, bring in the works of the Venetian school around it, and so on and so forth. And I thought, no, that's not really, that's just like a normal gallery display. And so what I did was I went around the National Gallery's collection, which is incredibly rich, and I mined it for works that had been inspired by Titian's example. And so on the right, you see Rubens' Three Graces. On the left, you see Rubens' Three Graces, and on the right, the Cezanne Bathers. This is one of the 3 large canvases painted near the end of his career. The other 2 are in Philadelphia. And I absolutely got such pushback on that. I had to talk and talk and talk and talk and talk. And in point of fact, if you go in, I can't do it so well with this slide, but there's a figure rushing in as Octaeon is rushing in, and I don't see how Cezanne would have done this without some knowledge of the Titian. He can't have known the original. The original was already in Britain and had been for a while, but he did know the painting from a marvelous engraving of it that had been done when it was in the Duke of Orleans collection. Anyway, this is just one wall of a room that was centered around this theme. And
Rubens was always historically influenced by Titian.
Absolutely, absolutely. And it's harder to tell perhaps in this broad view, but these beautiful nudes arranged in a landscape, he was very definitely looking at Titian. Rubens had seen the Titian when he visited Madrid for the first time in 1603. So Rubens certainly knew the Titian.
Now, this is a major project that you oversaw, which is really monumental. This is the Caravaggio project, yes?
Yes, Caravaggio, The Final Years, was an exhibition that treated the last 4 years of Caravaggio's life. From the time he kills Ranuccio Tomassoni in a duel in Rome, has to flee the city with a price on his head until his death untimely death, not yet 40, in 1610. And this was the first room of the exhibition. And if you'll go to the next slide, I'm going to show you the two images. The picture on the left is the National Galleries. It's from 1601, and so not from these final years. But the first thing that Caravaggio painted after he had fled Rome was another version of the same subject, the Supper at Emmaus, where the apostles on Easter Day walk with Jesus, not recognizing him the whole way, and it's only at dinner when he reaches and blesses the food that they recognize who they've been talking to. And this dramatic scene, in the earlier example, the young Caravaggio just really hitting his stride in 1601, explosive with these gestures. And the second one could not be more different. Painted 5 years later in 1606, you couldn't fault an undergraduate who didn't get that this is the same artist on a slide exam, because they are so different. The mood has changed completely. The youthful exuberance has been greatly, greatly toned down. This is more about doubt, the doubt of the apostles on that day in this dark scene. It's from the Pinacoteca di Brera in Milan.
On the right.
On the right.
Yeah.
And we couldn't get people out of that first room. They couldn't leave the juxtaposition of this. We created this huge bottleneck, even though the great flagellation of Christ from the museum in Capodimonte in Naples was right through the door, sighted on the door to draw people in. This period in his career, he painted about 24 things by my count. Other people would include others, a few others. And I got 17 of them. And the National Gallery, particularly press and marketing, was absolutely apoplectic because they kept arguing, but people are used to seeing 50 or more works when they come to an exhibition here. And besides, they're so dark and they're so religious. They were terribly worried about this. And so they put the price of the ticket down to £7.50 from £10 or £12. It depended on the show. And if you'll go to the next slide, the public didn't seem to be bothered by the dark religious paintings. Now, I have to admit, this was the last week of the show, but it was quite a sensation in London.
I just want one masterpiece.
Yeah, wouldn't it be great?
You know, my expectations are obviously much lower.
Getting 17 paintings, I worked harder than I would have worked for a big 60, 70 painting show. Getting those paintings was hard.
If you have a Caravaggio, you
don't
never let it go. You never let it go as a museum. And even in Naples, the flagellation picture in particular is so treasured. It's owned by the city, I think.
Owned by the city, not the museum.
And it's not even up for discussion, so for a loan. And then Velázquez.
Yes. This came about, the National Gallery, as I told you, has the second best collection of Velázquez's works outside the Prado. And this exhibition came about because the Prado needed the National Gallery to do an exhibition that it was planning on Velázquez as a history painter. And they couldn't have done it without London. And so we took this opportunity to do our own Velázquez show. And normally you get 1, 2 works out. We got 8 works by Velázquez from the Prado. And I just want to mention at this juncture, this is one corner. And on the left side, you see the great Apollo at the Forge of Vulcan, and from the Prado. And I wanted to mention this because most of you are aware, I'm going to show it in just a moment, that we just acquired a work by Philippe de Chanson portraying the Infanta Maria Anna, Philip IV, King Philip IV's sister. And it was painted in 1630. And the only reason that this portrait was entrusted to Dirac Sin is that Velázquez was absent. He was off in Rome. He'd been given leave by his king to go off and study. By the way, he got this leave because Rubens told the king, you got to let this artist go. He's got to go to Italy, and that's where he'll complete his education. And I'm going into all of this because the Apollo at the Forge of Vulcan is what Velázquez was painting in Italy when Dirac Sin was working on our portrait. And beside it is the St. Thomas Aquinas, the Temptation of St. Thomas Aquinas from the Diocesan Museum in Orihuela, which is down in the southeastern corner of Spain. There's the Rugby Venus again, here displayed with the Mars from the Prado, and I couldn't resist juxtaposing Venus, nude, beautiful form on the bed, with this image of the Infanta Maria Teresa by Velázquez in her farthingale to show what the Habsburgs did to their women.
I wanted to ask Dawson, we've had some great exhibitions recently he's helped us oversee in his tenure here, and I said, what was your favorite? What stood out? And this was one of them. You may remember this, Gods and Heroes from the École des Beaux-Arts. What was the year of this? 3 years ago, maybe?
Yeah,
about 3 years ago. And we were very fortunate to get this show. The École was looking to have their collection seen. I think they were doing some renovations. And I'd look at these pictures, and it was really quite spectacular.
It was, and it was a wonderful show to work on. It's a show about how art communicates. It was about how they taught art for almost 3 centuries in Paris. And therefore, it was about the language of art. And I think it compelled people for that reason. It included many magnificent things like the great Houdon écorché or flayed man we just saw. Here the students working, copying great ancient works of art, both in 3 dimensions and 2. And finally, the show culminated with a very great picture by Jacques-Louis David, his reception piece for the Royal Academy. And so what all the students at the École aspired to create a great, in this case, one of the greatest neoclassical pictures, the large one there on the left.
It was so gratifying to bring this collection here, and I think we've had a great diversity of exhibitions, and it was heartfelt that our community really embraced this, the classical painting exhibition. Very, very gratifying. Let's talk about the Dirac Sin, because we are at a point where we acquired this piece last fall, thanks to a number of individuals, including the Witzels. I want to recognize, thank you so much for your leadership, and the European American Art Council, a number of donors, several of you in this room. Thank you very much. And this was a great find. We were looking for a portrait. Dawson and I had found one in London at auction. We raised some money. We went to try to buy it. We didn't come close to what it sold for, so we took our dollars back, and then we found this picture. And where did you find it, Dawson? It was in Madrid, yes?
It came from a Spanish dealer, Jose Precedo, who mainly handles Spanish colonial paintings, but who had this work, and it's been incredibly gratifying since we bought it, because I found out that it was considered at the Met, Boston, and at the Prado. Now, at grand institutions like that, works like this always gets supplanted by something grander. And so it was left for us, and I'm absolutely delighted. I took Keith Christensen to see it, the head of European paintings at the Met when he was out visiting. And he walked into the room, and he's very excitable. Dawson, I remember this. So it's always great to have the approbation of your colleagues when you do buy something like this. But we're going to take you through. It's being cleaned. And this will just give you a hint. That hot red dress is not so hot. It's turning out to be a lovely cherry red. You can see down in that area has not been cleaned. There's partial cleaning, and just in this, that's kind of at the final cleaning stage. So you can see how very dirty and discolored the varnish and another surface coating was on that painting. And there you can really see with her complexion. On the left, before conservation began, mid-stage in the middle, and on the right, you can see those pearly flesh tones. And it's hard to see in these photographs, but she has little red eyelashes as well.
Dawson, when do we think we'll complete it?
Certainly by the 1st of April, it'll be back in the galleries. We're going to be hosting the Association for Spanish and Portuguese Historical Studies in Portland on the 5th of April, and so she's got to be into the galleries by then. Frame for her, an appropriate frame for her, is being built by Richard Borth up in Seattle. I'm going up next week to see him. And so thank you to all of you who made this possible.
It's a great legacy for this moment in our history, and I think it's a really significant picture. So thank you, and thanks everyone here for making it happen. Now, I did say to Dawson, okay, what is your dream picture? And here it is. Let's talk about this.
The sale of this
because I support you in this.
Was just announced this week. It's going to be sold on the 7th of March at a little auction house in Cambridge, England. And it is a marvelous portrait of a cane corso by the great Italian Baroque painter Guercino, probably made in the 1620s. And I just think this is wonderful. It's a true portrait. I mean, that dog, it's more than him recording breed characteristics. That dog has personality. Now, we knew that Guercino was a great dog painter. He really must have been a dog guy. If you'll show the next slide, this is the great Mastiff in the Norton Simon Museum in Pasadena. And then the next slide back to the little guy. And this would be absolutely marvelous. And of course, Portlanders love their dogs so much. This would be a great, great thing for us. However,
tell us how this works. Yeah, how does this work?
It's estimated to go for between 80 and 120,000 pounds. Got to add a zero, at least a zero. And then maybe, it depends on how it takes off. If you get two lovers of the Italian Baroque who are also dog lovers, there's going to be a duel for this. However, the British are great dog lovers as well. And so I'll be surprised. This was brought to England by an Englishman from his grand tour, brought back in the 18th century. So this needs an export license, and I'll be surprised if this gets out of the country. But wouldn't it be nice?
Yeah. When's the auction?
7th of March.
Okay. If anyone's interested, let us know.
Let us know.
But you have to give it to us. I wanted to conclude with one more slide. And if you know Dawson well, I think we're very fortunate because I think our natural landscape is a great attraction and has really helped us build our staff here. And if you know the staff and the team, and we all love the outdoors, and I think this picture in particular, and if you know Dawson, he loves to hike and be in the outdoors. So what does this picture mean to you, Dawson? And I'm sure we all have relationships with this.
I've been to a lot more distant places in this area. By no means, I've just scratched the surface, but been out to the Wallowas. But I have to say that I think one of the most thrilling experiences for me in Oregon so far was getting out to the Johnson Observatory beneath Mount St. Helens and walking out into the blast zone and doing that walk and that hike out into the blast zone where you see resurging life is just a thing of wonder and magnificence. And I remember that is one of the great, great days. And I've been out a couple of times now, but on that day it obviously was very clear and really beautiful.
Yeah, we certainly live in Eden. Thank you. It's great to have this conversation with you, and time did really fly by. I thought it was going to be a half hour, and we're here at an hour. Would love to take a few questions if you have any. We're happy to answer, Dawson.
And we do have microphones
We've got a
circulating
microphone
through the auditorium.
down here in the front row to Mr. Franson here.
Thank you. Dawson, wonderful conversation. Thank you. History of the Dirac Sin. Tell us a little more about where it's been all these years,
We don't know before the middle of the 19th century. In the middle of the 19th century, it's owned by a painter whose name was Valentin de Carderera. And he was a minor court artist, a portrait painter himself, but he's most famous for a vast compilation of portraits of great Spaniards from the Middle Ages through the 18th century, a multi-volume set. He sold the work late in his life to the Conde de Superunda, and it was ultimately bought from them through this dealer. One of the things that we learned when Nina Olson went in and started cleaning this is that the varnish layer had an enormous amount of soot in it. And normally you would think that this had been laid down over many, many years because it had been hung in a room with a fireplace. And in this case, the dealer told us, no, I don't think so, because the Superunda family palace was bombed during the Spanish Civil War. If you'll remember, Francisco Franco was one of the first to use the aerial bombardment of civilian populations as a tactic of war, most famously and infamously treated by Picasso in Guernica, more appropriately pronounced Guernica. And it also happened in Madrid. Fortunately, this was not in the room. They lost a whole room full of old master paintings in the fire that ensued. But chances are the soot was all laid down at one time. And that's all we know, Mark. Where it was before, because it was in Carderera's collection, and he was a court painter, I suppose there's a chance that it was a gift from the royal family or somewhat, but we just don't know anything. We might find out. I've been digging.
Thank you. Betsy, right here in the front row. Or third row.
Thank you for a great conversation. Could you tell us a little bit about what the experience was like of having Frederick Wiseman make the film at the National Gallery?
We had Fred for 3 months. He was with us, and he was with us a lot. And he was basically given unfettered access to our work, including he was allowed to attend a board meeting at one point, through most of the board meeting. And it was marvelous. It was marvelous having them around, having his critical eye, and just working with them. And I have to say, the result I found a bit tedious. I went with several members of our education department to see it down the road here. And I suppose because I'd never thought that about Wiseman's films before. His films that study the Paris Opera Ballet and the Comédie Française are absolutely compelling things. But because I knew this so well, I have to say I was squirming by the end. But this is being broadcast. I shouldn't be saying that, but never mind.
I think you're safe. You're safe. One more question. Yeah, Randy.
Dawson, I'm wondering, I mean, your career path doesn't seem like it would necessarily lead to Portland, and so I'm really curious, one, what drew you here? And two, what's the next big project that we'll see from you?
The next big project will be retirement. I had been in London for 10 years, and it was 10 magnificent years. But the decision to go to London, and I knew this when I took the decision to go, was a financial disaster. I was accepting a much lower salary. They're not paid to the same level there. And I was accepting a much lower salary than I knew at the Getty to move to one of the most expensive cities in the world. And I had to take a lot out of savings over that 10 years, and my savings aren't that deep. So some of it was that. I had just turned 60, And I was getting a little restless, thought I had maybe one more adventure in me. And so I was perusing the ads on the, one of the art history job websites. And I see this job in Portland, Oregon, and I see that there's a name attached. And so I knew that meant that it was endowed. And I went, what? Little Portland at this point in time, endowing a position in European art now? And that impressed me. And so I wrote a letter which made them all laugh, because how else do you start when you apply and you're sitting at the National Gallery? Then you're going to think I'm crazy. But, and Matthew Juniper, our head of preparations, just made his first trip to London a week ago and came back and said, what are you, nuts? Because when you experience the National Gallery's collection, I had to make my peace with that. I knew that. But Randy, I was hugely attracted to the beauty of the area. And when I came to interview, it was the staff. It was the curatorial staff that attracted me. And Brian, this ultimately, the tenor, the character of an institution is generated by Daddy. And Brian has created the nicest working environment that I certainly have ever known, and I laud him for that. It's not an easy thing to do in any institution, but it's a really, really lovely place to work. And I don't have to tell all of you what an awesomely wonderful place to live.
Thank you, Dawson.
I go back to London now, and I like being there. I like seeing all my friends, but the crush of the city, I can't wait to get back. So.
Thank you, everyone. Great to see you. Thanks, Dawson.